as a result. Really lovely to have you guys joining us this evening. I think a few more might pop in, but we're also going to record this so that those can watch it later who maybe weren't able to join us. This is part of quite a long-running series now in terms of our ALEF adult education program this year, which has been all about different topics that aren't necessarily about religion so much as Jewish culture and history. We've covered all sorts of things, from comic books to culinary exploits to this evening a bit of history that I find particularly interesting. And I hope you do too. I think it has a lot of import to today's life, which is usually the biggest value of history. Hello, Sarah. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you can see that window. And hopefully you can see the full screen now. Someone give me a thumbs up if you can. Yeah. Thank you, David. So I took a class when I was at rabbinical school. We had to take lots of different classes, which I'm glad to say is a good thing. Thumbs down. Screen sharing is paused. Why is that?
It says loading.
That's so strange.
It's just saying loading.
Try again.
Yeah, good idea.
We had the
You showed up for a minute then.
Because it showed up for the with all of them, with all the screens down the side, the main screen.
Yeah, when it went full screen, it didn't work, did it?
Yeah, that's right.
Oh, that's frustrating. Usually it does.
There we can see it now, and now we can't.
Oh, disappeared. So strange. So back.
Yes.
Well, that's irritating, but we'll have to deal with that. Hopefully you can see the slides at least. And I think we can make this bar go away. Yes, we can. So that gives us a bit more space at least. Not quite full screen, but we'll take it. So I had to take a lot of different classes at rabbinical school, which I think is a good thing. And quite a few of them were in history. And one in particular was about Jewish history in the Soviet Union. And a lot of it, I think I knew because I was a bit of a nerd about that in general. But there was one part that I didn't know at all and was completely new to me, which was the role of a particular organization called the Yevsektsia, which means section in Russian, and the role that it played in particular regarding Jewish life during the Russian Revolution and the years that followed. So what I want to do this evening is just kind of share with you some of that history, and then perhaps we can discuss why it matters, because I think it really does. A little bit of background for those who aren't as big of a nerd as myself. The Russian Empire of the 18th and 19th centuries had a huge Jewish population. Jewish population started to enter Russia and develop communities there from about the 11th century, moving eastward from Germany and from Prussia. And by the late 1700s, early 19th century, you had a huge population of Jews living, especially in the western part of Russia. Something that was formalized by Catherine II at the end of the 18th century, 1797 or so, when she created what we know as the Pale of Settlement, which is depicted partially on the map there. It's an old-fashioned map, but you can see that it's shaded to represent the percentages of Jews. So the Pale of Settlement was a geographical area referred to basically modern-day Belarus, a large portion of Ukraine, Moldova, and parts of what's today Russia, although you'll notice that many aspects of this map are very familiar from if you've been watching the news, as this precise area is kind of many of the areas that are contested in the southeast between Russia and Ukraine. And the Pale of Settlement was explicitly set out as the only place within the Russian Empire, which again stretched from what's now Poland all the way to Japan, where Jews could live. So Jews were prohibited to live anywhere else in the Russian Empire. And even within the Pale of Settlement, Jews were not permitted to live within cities. So Jews weren't allowed to live in Kyiv, even though it was within the Pale of Settlement. And they also weren't allowed to live on agricultural settlements, so collective farms, what was called kulaks at the time, which were kind of serfdom, basically. Jews weren't allowed to do that either, which left Jews very few options. You had a large amount of Jews. At the height of the Pale's population, just before the First World War, there were 5 million Jews in this strip of land. It's a very big strip of land, but it is a strip, a narrow strip between what's today Europe and Russia. 5 million Jews at that point represented 40% of the world's Jewish population. So it was heavily concentrated Jewish population in this area, and it created a lot of cultural things that didn't exist before. So before the Pale of Settlement, Yiddish was used in the Russian Empire, but only really in small groups, and it wasn't something that was necessarily a cultural touch point. Yiddish had been created as basically a pidgin form of German used by Jews trading in German in the 9th, 10th century, but it wasn't really used this far east until the Pale of Settlement created all of these Jews from different cultures within the empire living in one spot, and Yiddish became their common language. So Yiddish became very important to the people living there. Yiddish press, Yiddish publications, Yiddish culture, theater, art, drama, etc. And it also created what we call shtetls. And shtetl was in particular a small town, and it was a town that didn't have agricultural elements, and it also didn't have any urbanization, which left it in a lot of poverty. Most of the inhabitants of these shtetls were only able to work in what we would, I guess, call service professions these days, often in money lending, in things like being a trader, a middleman, being involved in metallurgy, tinsmithing, those sort of things. And many of those were professions that were both looked down on and didn't pay very well. So it was purposefully set up. It was very intentionally set up by the Russian government to create an opportunity or lack of opportunity for Jews, and a location in which Jews could be successfully exploited in one region of the empire. There were some Jews who got out of the Pale. Usually those were Jews who were in the nobility, and there were some who were nobility in Russia, or Jews who had been educated highly enough that they could live in the big cities and they got special permission to do so. But even then, periodically, they would ship Jews back to the Pale if they didn't like them. So if you were a wealthy, educated Jew living in Moscow, but you upset your neighbor, the first thing they would do is deport you back to the Pale, even if you had never lived there before. And this existed for well over 100 years, from 1797 all the way up until 1914. And really until the Russian Revolution, 1917. So you had a very long critical period of time during which Jews in the Russian Empire were largely living in a huge, open-walled ghetto. You can see this really well on a map like this. This is a map that depicts Yiddish speakers in the Russian Empire. Also, just a shout out to how big Russia was then. It's still pretty big, but it was even bigger then. The borders are going to China on one side, to Iran on the other, and then to basically Germany on the top. And you can see Finland is kind of ambiguously in and out. But you can see the Pale of Settlement very clearly on what's the top left side of the map here, which of course is, if you turn your head a bit, where we normally draw the map and we see Europe, we see that side of Russia, what's called European Russia, all the way to the western side. And that is where all the Jews were heavily concentrated. And you can even see that the part of it that juts out towards Prussia is even more heavily densely populated. This becomes key to much of Jewish history, particularly in the Second World War, because this strip of land here ends up being the primary battleground between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. And of course, it's also where most Jews live. So the border and the battle line was exactly moving through the historical Pale settlement, which is part of the reason that so many Jews from this area were killed in the Holocaust. It's a really great book, really difficult book, a really good book called Bloodlands, by Timothy Snyder, about this strip of land and the role it played in the Second World War. But long before that, the Pale gradually collapsed for a variety of reasons. One was emigration. So the Jews living in the Pale started to suffer more and more pogroms. Particularly in 1881, you started to see very large mass-scale pogroms in which Russians who lived in the Pale and outside of the Pale would come in and just massacre Jews, burn down shtetls, etc. This was partially sparked by the assassination of the Tsar in 1881, Tsar Alexander II. He actually wasn't killed by Jews, he was killed by an anarchist organization. And they put a bomb under his carriage. But the rumor got out very quickly that the Jews had killed him, and as a result, it provoked literally 3 years of pogroms. That's how bad the ability for information to be corrected was at the time. So from 1881 to 1914, you had over 2 million Jews from the 5 million that had been there at the peak emigrate elsewhere. Most of them to the United States, many to England, some to elsewhere, South America, anywhere that would accept them, really. And this is the period where you have huge influx of Jews, both to the East End of London, as well as to New York City, Ellis Island, that whole culture. My great-grandfather and his family were in this group, as most people who are Jewish and from America will say the same, right? They have at least one relative who's in this group of 2 million Jews that fled from the Pale, mostly to America during this time. However, that still left a lot of Jews behind, over 3 million and more actually. And those Jews who left behind during the same period from 1880s until 1914 got gradually more and more involved in the many different political movements that were brewing at the time. The Russian Empire had been an entity for about 1,000 years at this point, on and off, and it was extremely oppressive as empires went of its own people until Tsar Alexander II, all millions of people were in serfdom, which is basically a form of indentured servitude or slavery, borderline slavery. Jews were living in the Pale and incredibly deeply discriminated against. And this prompted a lot of Jews to be attracted to extremist political views on many different sides. Primarily, those were socialist political expressions, because the different varieties of socialism in the Russian Empire at the time all promised liberation and equality. And so this was very appealing to young Jewish people in particular. And most of the people who were involved in the revolution, of course, were born during this period, 1880s, 1890s, because they were mostly in their 30s or 40s during the revolution in 1917. So this is a critical period, that generation that grew up in Russia at this time, without exception, were involved in a lot of extreme political views. And for Jews, that meant they had a choice. Largely, the two options presented to them were the Bund, which was a way of referring to the Jewish labor Bund, Bund being a Yiddish German word for an union organization. The Bund was a Yiddishist organization, so anti-Hebrew, and a secularist organization, so anti-religion, and a Marxist organization. They weren't Bolsheviks. That nuance is a little bit more obscure, but we'll get to it in a second. But they were Marxists and socialists and advocated for revolution. And because they were socialists, they were international by default, which meant that they believed all people are the same and there's nothing particularly special about Jews. And so this is part of the reason that they in particular became the enemies of the other emergent ideology during this time, which we know as Zionism. Zionism during this time, starting in Western Europe and then moving into Eastern Europe, was starting to become very influential. And what I mean by influential is you had both of these groups, Bundists and Zionists, organizing youth clubs, organizing self-defense patrols, having meetings, having all sorts of kind of civic and administrative interaction with the population. There were many more people involved in the Zionist movement than there were in the Bund. As you can see the numbers here, it's about 10 to 1. But because the history of Russia and the Soviet Union becomes very much the history of socialism, people know a lot more about the Bund and its offshoot, which is the Yevsektsia. So Jews were genuinely involved in all of these different movements, a variety of them. And it gets really, really titchy about kind of this movement and that movement, and these guys don't like that guys, and they all split off and whatever. More or less, there were lots of different, a whole spectrum of socialist political activities happening in the 1880s to 1920s. And gradually, those solidified into the RSDLP, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, which was the revolutionary Marxist party. There was also what was called the SRs, which were the social reformers, social democrats, who were a little bit more moderate. There were other ones that had different names. There were all sorts of different moderate, mild, extreme, radical, etc. socialists. And Jews were involved in all of these different groups, actually, much more than you would expect, much more than the population would indicate. So there's some interesting statistics here, not only with the Mensheviks, which was the majority of the RSDLP, that's what Menshevik means, the majority. They were led by two Jewish figures, Julius Martov and Pavel Axelrod. But the Bolsheviks, who of course are the ones who become in power, surprisingly, also had a large portion of Jews involved. It says here there were 5% of the total membership of the Bolsheviks in 1922, which is after the revolution, of course, and after the Civil War is largely concluded. So many people in particular associate Jews closely with Bolshevism, which we'll say more about in a second. But in some way, that's both false, because obviously 5% is a tiny amount. But then again, 5% is much more than is a proportional representation of Jews in the world or in Russia. And many of those Jews were quite high profile in the Bolshevik Party in particular, most famously Leon Trotsky. There were Jews who supported other movements in Russia. There were very few, but I'm sure there were a few who supported the Tsar and what became known as White Russia, which was the Tsarist version of Russia that was eliminated during the revolution. But by and large, Jews were involved in some kind of radical revolutionary politics. Could be the anarchists, could be the socialists, the Marxists, whatever, and often fought with each other over it. This is a poster, by the way, for the Bund recruiting people to come to a meeting. I just love the graphic design of this guy yelling. This is a very different kind of poster, which was used by the White Russian army in 1921 during the Civil War, after they had already lost much ground to the Bolsheviks, which became very familiar to many people. And it's an image in particular, it's meant to depict Leon Trotsky, who was Jewish, and this idea that Judaism and Bolshevism are linked together, that the Bolsheviks are a Judaic movement, that Marxism is a Jewish project. There's lots of ways in which this is still very present. A lot of the conspiracy theories that are causing a lot of harm today and causing a lot of anti-Semitism today still use this same rhetoric that Jews and Bolshevism and Marxism are all closely linked together. It comes back to the very beginning of the anti-Bolshevik movement in Russia and what's called the White Russian supporters, who were both anti-Semitic and anti-Bolshevik. And so for them, it naturally combined together to say that Jews are Bolsheviks. They also created the famous forgery called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which a White Russian spy made in Paris in 1905 and claimed to be the minutes of a meeting where the Jews sat around and planned world domination. If they'd ever been to any meeting that Jews had actually planned, they would know that it was not so well organized, and you'd never get all the Jews to agree on a plan of world domination in the first place. And it was obviously, a forgery, but it became the most influential forgery in world history. It was seen as gospel by the Nazis and is the second most published book in many Arab countries today after the Quran, which is troubling. So these ideas of Jews and Bolsheviks being closely interlinked had some basis, because there were many prominent Jewish Bolsheviks and other socialists, but they weren't necessarily any more than you would expect, considering their history of oppression within the Russian Empire. What happens, sorry, I missed a thing there. What happens is that, I said here, while many Jews do support the Bolsheviks, the two mainstream organizations we talked about before, the Bundists and the Zionists, actually were sidelined by the Bolsheviks pretty quickly. The Zionists, for obvious reasons, because the Bolsheviks were internationalists and rejected any nationalist claim. So, for instance, the state of Georgia proclaimed independence during the Russian Revolution, and that was then very cruelly put down by the Bolsheviks, because any sense of nationalism was enemy to their beliefs. So that made sense that Zionism would be a target for the Bolsheviks. What made a little bit less sense is that Bundists were also a target by the Bolsheviks. In a classic example of leftist infighting, the Bundists were seen as insufficiently Bolshevik. They weren't Marxist enough for the Bolsheviks, and so were often attacked as being bourgeois by the Bolsheviks and purged in many of the early days. The counter to this, and the thing that's mostly what I think is worth discussing, is what was called the Yevsekstia, which again, it just means section, and it referred to the Jewish section of the Communist Party as it was established in 1918 following the Russian Revolution. And the Yevsektsia was an organization kind of loosely constructed whose sole role was to be responsible for Jewish affairs within the Soviet Union, very early days of the Soviet Union. We're talking 1919 to 1929. It existed for 10 years. And during that time, they were responsible for dealing with Jewish communal organization, Jewish religious life, the instruction of Jewish religion, and how to deal with the different Jewish segments of the population, both Bundists and Zionists. A lot of the people who joined the Yevsektsia were formerly Bundists, so they had a background in Jewish, secular, Yiddishist, anti-Hebrew, anti-Zionist work. But the Yevsektsia was a much more radical version of it. It was personally supported by Lenin, who didn't want to persecute Jewish communities himself, and so found some Jews who were willing to do it for him. And it made similar commitments as the Bund did as an organization to be anti-Zionist, internationalist, Yiddishist, and to support the Bolshevik Party. Key to the establishment and success of the Yevsektsia was one person individual, really interesting guy named Semyon Dimonstein, who was at one point a rabbi, a revolutionary, and in the 1920s was Joseph Stalin's personal spokesperson. So this is him, Prima Stein. He's a really interesting kind of little bit of a window into how an organization like this developed. He was born in 1886, grew up like most Jews in Russia in the Pale, in a shtetl, very poor. His father was a tinsmith, wasn't a lot of money coming into the house. His education was predominantly religious because there were no state schools. So if you wanted to learn anything, you went to cheder, which was, of course, always taught in a religious environment. And he went to many famous yeshivot as a young man. You might know the names of Telz, Slobodka, or Lubavitch, probably most famously from the Chabad movement that emerged from there. He was actually ordained as a rabbi in 1903 at the age of 17 in Vilna. So he traveled to Vilna, which at this point was 50 or 60% Jewish as a city, now the capital of Lithuania called Vilnius. But he couldn't find a job working as a rabbi and turned to be a revolutionary instead. That was the zeitgeist of the time. He ended up being appointed the head of the Yevsektsia and its newspaper, and he was probably the one who most advocated the idea that the Yevsektsia was a third way to answer the so-called Jewish question. The Jewish question in this case, not the Nazi version, but the Soviet version, being how can Jews be supportive of the Soviet Union and also retain an individual identity? Because central to the whole mission of the Soviet Union was the elimination of nationalities. And the so-called nationalities question was debated by Lenin and Stalin and all of the early Bolsheviks often. So Prima Stein was very close to these guys, spent a lot of time with them. He fought in the revolution. He was on one of the famous battles that happened against the White Russians. He was through and through a key Bolshevik leader. And he became the representative of Jewish people to the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks appointed him in his role as head of the Yevsektsia as the representation of Bolshevism to Jews in Russia, in the Soviet Union. He did several interesting things in addition to kind of supporting and creating the Yevsektsia. One of them was he had this idea that Stalin was quite keen on to create something called a Jewish autonomous oblast. So he thought that the way to respond to Zionism was actually to create a Jewish oblast, a Jewish region within the Russian Empire, now the Soviet Union, which would be populated by Jews. They picked, inexplicably, somewhere called Birobidzhan, which is all the way over by the border with Mongolia, in the far, 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 far east. Actually, if we go back to that map, you will see where it is, because some Jews did end up settling over here in Birobidzhan, a long way from where most of Russia's central activity is. Birobidzhan was and is a kind of tepid swamp full of malaria, where there's no cities and no activity. And this idea that it could be promoted as an alternative to Zionism, that rather than these young Jews going to Israel and trying to reclaim their homeland, they could just build a new homeland in this swamp over by Mongolia. It's kind of bonkers, actually, but they really went through it. They had a whole flag, they had a whole immigration society to help people move there. All the people that moved there died, mostly of malaria. But it was an idea which Stalin continued to push all the way until the Second World War. And there's some really interesting stories on that. There's a great book by Masha Gessen about the Birobidzhan experiment, and it all comes from Prima Stein. This was his attempt to try and answer the question of Zionism, but from what he saw as a Bolshevik point of view. In 1938, though, like many people who were key to the revolution in the early days, by 1938, long after the Yevsektsia had stopped existing, he was arrested for being a counter-revolutionary and was executed during the purges. So were every other leader of the Yevsektsia during the 1920s. So no amount of being close to Stalin or Lenin, no amount of advocating for the party line of the Bolsheviks, no amount of being sufficiently anti-Jewish protected him from ultimately being seen as too Jewish for Stalin, which is perhaps the object lesson of much of this. A little bit about what the Yevsektsia did during their time. And this is one of their posters, by the way. You can see, I don't know how good your Yiddish reading is. Mine isn't very good. But it says, Das Revolutionäre Russland, the Russian Revolution. And it's a promotional book that was written in Yiddish to inspire people about the Russian Revolution. So Yevsektsia under Prima Stein saw its mission basically as a complete destruction of Jewish life. And that's really the key thing that the Yevsektsia is known for. They not only attacked the Zionist movement, but also the Bund. They created a newspaper called Der MS, which ironically was dedicated to the complete destruction of the Hebrew language. Emes, of course, is a Yiddish version of the Hebrew word emet. So the very newspaper, which is designed to say that Yiddish has nothing to do with Hebrew, used a Hebrew loanword into Yiddish in its title. But who am I to tell them that? The Yevsektsia created an entirely new spelling system for Yiddish called Soviet Yiddish, in which they completely redesigned the way in which Yiddish was written to eliminate any hint that it was related to Hebrew. So Hebrew grammar and orthography were eliminated, and Yiddish was completely rewritten in a new way during this time period. The Yevsektsia sent small bands, usually 10 to 15 people, of young people, mostly teenagers, people in their early 20s, who were fervent Bolsheviks and Jews, to go out and attack Hebrew language publications, newspapers, theaters. Famously, they attacked and partially burnt down a theater called Habima, which means the stage, which was one of the first Hebrew language theaters in Europe, which all the people then involved in it fled to Israel, to mandatory Palestine, and Habima ended up becoming the national theater of Israel. The Yevsektsia also attacked not just secular organizations, but religious ones. They closed rabbinical schools. They attacked and arrested rabbis. They held show trials of these counter-revolutionary Jews and rabbis on the high holidays to make a point in the synagogues. There's many photos and videos, not so much videos, but much evidence of them burning synagogue books, removing pews from synagogues. Many synagogues were destroyed and converted into communist youth clubs. Any hint of religiosity was often seen as a threat to the Bolshevik anti-religious stance. They not only, remember, these are young Jews attacking other Jews, but they also worked very closely and collaborated in sharing information with the Cheka, which was the early stage of the secret police, and then what was later called the NKVD, which was Stalin's era secret police, to burn down synagogues, capture, torture, execute thousands of Jews, and basically attempt to systematically destroy Jewish life in Russia. This was all done by Jews, many of whom were well educated. Remember, Prima Stein was a rabbi at one point. And that was precisely why they were commissioned to do this, and why they were so closely involved with the revolution, is because they could be trusted to be the standard bearers of a different type of Judaism and an anti-Zionist version of Judaism. So we come to this idea that often gets circulated around of kind of good Jews and bad Jews. And it's really important to note that the critical thing for the early Soviet leaders, especially Stalin, but others as well, was that the Yevsektsia were Jews. This wasn't non-Jews attacking Jews. Lenin and Stalin, on paper and in principle, were very opposed to anti-Semitism. They had spoken out against pogroms. They, of course, were very opposed to Hitler and everything Hitler stood for. So they weren't going to publicly or privately necessarily be too involved with persecuting Jews. But they were happy for some Jews to persecute other Jews. And they could easily step back and say, well, that's their business, right? It's an inter-Jewish conflict. And this was really key to the strategy, was that they could not be accused of anti-Semitism when there were other Jews executing rabbis, burning down synagogues, banning the teaching of Hebrew. It was seen as good Jews and bad Jews, a dynamic that has occurred many, many times in Jewish history and continues to do so. By 1929, they basically accomplished everything they wanted to, and Stalin had lost interest in this project in particular. And so during the 1930s, Stalin systematically himself arrested and executed all the people involved with the Yevsektsia. During the purges, we don't really know how many people were killed, but many of them were leaders of these Jewish movements who were seen as kind of tainted by their involvement with it. And that's really the sad thing in some way. And it is a sad story that you have to imagine someone like Prima Stein really thought that he was providing for Jewish liberation by helping to create this Yevsektsia, that even if it wasn't what he imagined Judaism had been when he was younger, it was a way of preserving Judaism in the Soviet Union. But even that didn't work. Right? Even the Yevsektsia, whose whole mission was the destruction of Hebrew culture, Jewish religion, and Zionist politics, found at the end of the day they were still too Jewish for Stalin and for the Bolsheviks. They were tainted by their own actions, and ultimately led to their own downfall. It's just a really troubling and interesting quote here from an essay that talked a lot about the role this played in how religious leadership formed in the Soviet Union, which I'll just read because it might be hard to see on screen. The central facts of the persecution of Judaism by the Soviet authorities with the active participation of the Yevsektsia are well known. the forcible confiscation of synagogues, houses of study, and religious schools, the outlawing of the cheder, and the widespread prosecution of Melamedim, teachers, public show trials against rabbis, mohalim, and shochtim. They're mohels, who do circumcision, and shochtim, who are ritual slaughters. The growing enforcement of the 6-day work week with Saturday as a working day, campaigns of anti-religious propaganda and intimidation around the time of Passover and the high holidays, anti-religious instruction in the Soviet Yiddish schools, reprimands and reprisals against party members and state workers who circumcised their children or attended synagogue. And then in the 1930s, the banning of the manufacture and importation of matzah, and so on and so on. David Fishman, who was my professor who taught us more about this, could go on for a very long time about all the things the Yevsektsia did, and some of it is pretty poorly documented. But a few things stand out from this list in particular. One is the banning of ritual, and particularly mohalim, who were persecuted, and the idea that there were reprimands and reprisals for those who circumcised their children. Also, preventing matzah being made. These are the sort of persecutions that we associate very closely with our historical sense of anti-Semitism, particularly around something like Hanukkah, for instance. And that sense of there being Jews who are the ones responsible for this persecution against other Jews is obviously really troubling. And the thing I just wanted to end on, and perhaps we can discuss a bit, and happy to answer any questions, although I'm by no means an expert, which I should have led with, is that there's a really interesting article written by Dara Horn. So Dara Horn she's a Jewish novelist and Hebrew scholar in America, and she wrote a really excellent book about a year or two ago called People Love Dead Jews, which if you haven't read, I really can't recommend enough. It's a series of short essays dealing with kind of a variety of unpopular opinions around anti-Semitism. And of course, the basic thesis is clear, that people love dead Jews more than they love living ones. But she wrote a really lovely long-form article about the Yevsektsia called The Cool Kids. It's on tablet. You can look it up online if you're interested to read it. And she frames this whole story as one about what she calls Hanukkah anti-Semitism versus Purim anti-Semitism. And as we're in the season in which we have Hanukkah and then Purim coming up next, it's worth reflecting on. So the Purim story is very straightforward. The Purim story is about prejudice. Right? You have the evil, wicked guy who works for the king, who doesn't like Jews, who discriminates against them. They're not Jews persecuting Jews. There's definitely a clear sense that this is a racialized and prejudicial system. And in some way that makes sense in the context of Purim. Hanukkah is a very different story. Right? Hanukkah is largely the story of a civil war between those Jews who were willing to assimilate and support the Greek Hellenistic empires that were around versus those Jews which were attempting to resist that and fight against it. And of course, we celebrate the ones who fought against the Hellenization and assimilation of Jews in that time period. That's the Maccabees, our heroes that we praise. And it's ultimately a story that we don't talk too much about because it's quite troubling, right? We talk about the story of the miracle. We talk about the simplifications of the story by the rabbis. But Hanukkah is ultimately about the fight of some Jews against other Jews and against this idea that there's good Jews and bad Jews. And this Hanukkah-type anti-Semitism, as Dara Horn calls it, recurs over and over and over in Jewish history. The first time that the popes burnt the Talmud, I think in 1220 in France, they had gotten the idea, they were inspired for this idea by seeing a local Jewish community in Montpellier burning copies of Maimonides' Code of Jewish Law. Because the Jews in France were so upset by what Maimonides, a famous rabbi from Spain and then Egypt, wrote, that they actually burned copies of his book in the public square. And the local church officials saw Jews burning other Jews' books and went, ooh, that's a good idea. We should burn some Jewish books. And that was the start of the burnings of Talmud that happened publicly through the next 800 years. In the context of the Second World War, there were obviously many examples of Jews who attempted to collaborate with the Nazis in order to help preserve themselves, and sometimes with good intentions to help preserve their Jewish communities. But ultimately, it never succeeded nor benefited them. There was even a whole organization of Jews who were pro-Nazi for a short period of time in the 1930s, all of whom ended up dead in a concentration camp. So this, I mean, that's a very dramatic example, but this dynamic of the good Jews and the bad Jews is very much still something that plays out today. And I think that's what makes it so important, actually, in some way, is that we are dealing with a huge amount of anti-Semitism today, different kinds than we've seen before in some ways, but also some very familiar kinds. And often the struggle around anti-Semitism becomes the fight between some Jews versus other Jews. I don't want to dwell on it too much, but I think there's an interesting allegory with the last 5 years and the arguments around the Labour Party and the interaction between the Jewish labor movement versus the Jewish voice of labor, who were these two different segments of labor Jewish representation, one of which was a majority, which is the Jewish labor movement, one of which is a very small minority, the Jewish voice for labor. But whenever it was covered by the BBC, I remember hearing a radio broadcast, and they gave equal time on the broadcast to JVL and JLM. And I think it was Jeremy Vine, and the presenter, kind of indicated, well, this looks like it's split, right? There's some people who feel this way and some people feel this way. And what that does is it gives credence and credit to non-Jews to be able to say, well, I can think this because look, there's some Jews who think this too. And that happens hugely today when you have Jewish synagogues in America and around the world whose sole mission is to promote AntiZionism. That's the greatest ammunition that the anti-Zionist non-Jews ever have, is to be able to point at Jewish communities who are expressing these views and go, well, if they say it, then it's okay for me. And that idea is something that has not gone away, not since the time of the Maccabees in 167 BCE, and not in the last 100 years. I think the Yevsektsia is probably the best example in some way of this conflict within the Jewish community, and the attempt by some to try and be acceptable to the non-Jewish authorities, to be the good Jews, which ultimately always ends in tragedy, both for the Jews they prosecute and persecute and for themselves. So it's a bit of a cautionary tale, I imagine, but a really interesting chapter, I think, in Russian history and in Jewish history from about 100 years ago. What do you guys think? Questions, thoughts? What does this signify to you? Is this new?
I'd like to say just about that last point that you were saying, because it's easier for us to register what's happening today as opposed to what happened 200 years ago. And it's interesting when you say about the Jewish labor within the Jewish labor movement, those Jews who want to seem on the good side of and to assimilate. You've also got those who aren't doing it for that reason. They're doing it because that's what they truly believe. So the Notorious Carter, for instance, who also turn up at demonstrations with Palestinian flags and stuff like that. They're not doing it in order to be on the good side of the Palestinians. They're not doing it in order to be looked at by the world as, oh, there are Jews who hate the Jews. They're doing it for another purpose. They're doing it because their true belief is that there shouldn't be an Israel today. And I think we need to separate between them.
Yeah. Although I imagine you could say that very much when they started, and I think it was in the 1970s, you really saw them emerging as a movement. But today, I think part of the reason they show up is because they love the attention that comes with it of representing the anti-Jewish Jewish voice. And they make a special effort to appear as Jewish as possible, the Notorious Carta, right? To make sure they've got the big beards and make sure they've got all the dress. And of course, that is their day-to-day dress. They're not pretending. But it only further creates this image of, oh, yes, well, there's some very legit Jews who seem to be saying the right thing. So it can't be, they're not all wrong. And that just really chips away at any kind of sense of unity. And it's not inevitable, but it does happen in many different places and times in strange ways. And it's a different case, perhaps, that's motivated by religion, which is happening more and more. You have Jews motivated by religion who are the good Jews, as opposed to the opposite, as it was in the Yevsektsia. It's a troubling thing to know how to respond to, I have to say, as someone who is often called on to respond to what's perceived as anti-Semitism, because who am I to say that someone who's Jewish is not entitled to their opinion about Jewish matters, whether that's Semyon Dimenstein or Notorious Carta or anyone else? if we can say that Jews are allowed to have a view about things related to Judaism, then we can't say that these Jews are wrong and these Jews are right. But it does affect very deeply the way in which the outside world sees the Jewish community, and it gives pegs and footholds for many different points of view that's then projected onto a relatively insular Jewish debate.
I mean, I was thinking, oh, sorry. No, I was thinking that, just thinking back, you did the talks on the sages, and, around that time, you had different belief system, you had disagreement, and that led to conflict, and ultimately to one way winning over another way. There's something a bit different here about I think there's something about the fact that it's almost like it's a bit like a Trojan horse, isn't it? Almost maybe that's not the right expression, but there's something about the fact that it becomes a way in which, but I guess what I'm saying is, if there is internal conflict, almost by definition, there will be one, you could the sort of big external side could have latched onto any one of those internal forces and chosen them as the ones to back, to do the destruction, and then they'll destroy them at the end, if you see what I mean. If you're being cynical about it.
Which I think history definitely leads you to be pretty cynical about things in general. I think there's lots of different examples of this phenomenon, and it's hard to pin down exactly who it benefits, other than I think the main takeaway is it doesn't benefit us.
No.
No matter what happens, it doesn't benefit us. And one of the things I found very troubling in learning more about Jewish history was the predominance in the medieval period of these debates that would be held between a rabbi and a priest. And the priests that they trotted out to do these debates were always, without exception, formerly Jews who had converted to Catholicism. And that was the priest that they brought out to argue with the rabbi. And there's something very nefarious about that. And part of it is because this priest, Alfonso, who used to be named, Avraham, he knows the Talmud. He maybe did some learning. He has some experience, so he's able to engage with the rabbi he's debating with. But it's also partially a kind of supremacism, and that's a very Christian approach to this issue, which is to say, oh, look, some Jews know what's right, and we've got plenty of them, enough to be able to demonstrate that. And it's held up, like you said, almost as a kind of a Trojan horse to get in under the skin of Jewish communities and try and infiltrate it. Sarah, what were you going to say?
I was saying that simply that these people don't consider the responsibility they have. So
I don't think anyone's thinking about how is this going to be used by the rest of the world. What is this going to mean to them? That's probably not what's motivating them.
But they should consider it.
Yeah, I think that there should be a difference between how we talk to each other internally and how we talk externally about each other. That makes sense. Because your words can very easily be used against you. If it's like fighting with your family, it's one thing to argue with your family behind closed doors. It's another thing when you're out in public, it's then kind of somewhat changes the way in which you're perceived.
So that seems to be critical, right? Which is that it's okay to disagree about stuff, and I think it seems, from what I've learned from you over the last week, that there's quite a lot of disagreement within Judaism about
everything,
right? But when you're in a minority, you need to be aware that can be picked up on and used against you in totality. And so how can you have that debate safely without it leading to some sort of form of destruction? And And I think you need to be aware of the wider context in which you're having that debate. I think that goes to what Sarah was saying about the responsibility.
Yeah, I think you're right.
I think all groups do have, especially minority groups, would have the same issue. I don't think it's something unique to us. So that's one thing I was going to say. The other thing is, so often the group will say, "Oh, I'm allowed to criticize because I am." So I'm allowed to criticize Jews who do X, Y, and Z because I'm Jewish and I understand these things. And sometimes they do understand what they're doing and sometimes they don't. And just to give an example that Robin will appreciate, I don't know how much other people would, you might as well, an issue, something like Jamie Redknapp is always the token ex-Tottenham who's on a panel discussion. He doesn't like Tottenham, but people say, oh, he played for Tottenham. And Gary Lineker yesterday tweeted that he didn't think it was a penalty when everyone said it was a penalty. Well, Gary Lineker should know because he played for Tottenham. So if he says it wasn't a penalty, it's not a penalty. And it's that minority who represent, whether the society take them as representing or not, they automatically, and that's what you were saying, they automatically push them into that situation, whether it's the priest who converted to, or the minority. Oh, he, that person, she, he, they represent them because they are them.
Yeah. And it's often a marginal voice that ends up representing a minority to the broader culture. And we also have to be aware of that, right? When we deal with or see, representations of Muslim, of Hindu, of other religious communities, the person who you meet at a fundraiser who's there to represent their community probably only really represents themselves and is probably there specifically because they're quite marginal in their communities. This happens a lot in interfaith spaces, that you have the people most involved in interfaith spaces tend to be the ones who agree least with their co-religionists about the question of interfaith interaction, which is true of us as well, right, to some degree. And that acknowledgement of that is actually really difficult because it undermines the whole idea of interfaith, because you want to believe that everyone around the table is a representative of the religion that they're there for, but actually they're more likely than not representative. So it's a challenge in living in a multicultural society in which we all are moving within and without these different identities. But it's definitely had it happens to all minorities, and I'm sure it has interesting impacts in others. But it's definitely done a lot of damage to Jewish communities in the last 100 years in particular. And, I think it's telling that as we move towards Hanukkah, the story of Hanukkah is really about this issue. It's about, which side are we on? Are we on the Jews for Hellenism or the Jews against Hellenism? And, the first action, the first thing that happens in the war of the Maccabees is that Matthias, who was formerly connected to the priestly family, is living in this small village in the Galilee. One day, the local governor from the Seleucid Empire comes and requires everyone in the village to make a sacrifice to the emperor, Antiochus, to prove their allegiance to the emperor. And Matthias refuses, and several of the other Jews refuse. And then one Jew from the village goes up to the altar and says, more or less kind of says, well, I don't want them to kill us all, so I'll do the thing. I'll sacrifice the animal. I'll say what he wants. Nobody cares. And Matthias, his first act of rebellion is killing that Jew. So the Hanukkah story begins with a Jewish person who's anti-Hellenism killing the one Jewish person who was willing to be pro-Hellenism in his village. And it spills out from there into basically a civil war. And that danger is very much present in the story of Hanukkah, although we don't usually talk about that part. We talk about the miracle of the oil and whatever else. The story is ultimately one about the tension between Jewish communities and within them. And it's a good season in some way to think about that.
Can I be very controversial? Sorry, can I be very controversial?
Yeah, please be controversial.
Be very controversial. I throw a spanner in the works, and I'm not giving an opinion here. It's a question that I'm to open up to the floor as to whether different communities, for better or worse word, different sections, if we've learned to talking about sections of observance creating different united synagogues, and Federation Synagogue and Masorti Judaism and Reform and Liberal and Progressive Reconstructionist, are they helping matters in what we're talking about? Because one of them might come along and say, well, I want to be more like the English society. The Reform movement, in Germany,
even a couple of weeks ago, there was an example where the Reform movement put out a paper here in the UK that said that they approved electric stunning for kosher slaughter.
Right.
And the BBC picked up on this, and there was an article that said Jews now approve electric stunning for kosher slaughter. And the United Synagogue lost their mind, saying, no, Jews don't, just the Reform. We don't feel the same way. And then the BBC got confused, and the article kind of fell by the wayside. So it is relevant, I think, in some way. Although hopefully it's less nefarious and leads to less violence, it is used in terms of the outside community looking at Judaism, going, "Oh, they can't even agree on anything."
But that's what originally in Germany, when the Reform movement started, it was let's be more German. That was what they were saying. Let's be more German than
let's be acceptable.
Yeah.
And that desire to be acceptable to non-Jews around us, the desire to be, it's a very diaspora identity question. Ultimately, is the push to be seen as legitimate and valuable and desirable is what's behind the Yevsektsia and what's behind so much of the stuff that's affected Jewish communities, those who were forced to convert and those who converted because they thought it would save their families. And all of the violence that's been done is often about this dynamic within the Jewish community being exploited on the outside of it. And that hasn't changed. And it's still very much something which affects us in ways we're not aware of. And yes, David, I don't think it's so controversial, because I think it's true that part of the problem with having all these different movements is it exacerbates this issue, and it makes Judaism look very fragmentary to the outside world and allows them to say, well, these ones seem all right, I don't know about those ones, when really we should be emphasizing our similarities more than our differences. But don't tell the United Synagogue I said that.
Or tell them the Masorti movement.
Yeah. I'll have to edit this for it, go on YouTube.
We're doing it as well.
We absolutely are. And we do it all the time in small ways. Instead of focusing on what makes Judaism similar to what makes Judaism cohesive, we tend to emphasize, well, they do this, but we do it this way, right? Even in one family, oh, that's the German custom, we do it the Spanish way. Or, even in one city, well, on that street, that synagogue, they do that, but we do it this way. There's nothing necessarily unhealthy about having diverse customs and beliefs, but there's a difference between celebrating diversity and embracing the idea that we are a multivocal, multicultural, multi-identity community, and using that or allowing that to be used as a weapon. I think that's the tricky thing.
And that's the whole sort of wider diversity dilemma. It's like we should be celebrating the difference. And there are differences within the Jewish community, and those different, the whole thing about diversity is celebrating the difference and using it to bring the differences together is stronger than all trying to be exactly the same. And it's how you get the balance between sort of fitting in and coexisting while maintaining your identity.
I think that's crucial what you just said, celebrating it and coexisting. It's not highlighting the differences between Masorti Judaism and United Synagogue. It's saying we can exist alongside you, not criticizing what they do or saying we accept something that you don't. It's saying, yes, you accept it. We accept what you say. We're slightly different. We're not saying what you do is wrong. And I think that's maybe the big difference between what you were talking about, what we were talking about originally with the Bund and the Zionisms and they were anti. We don't want to be anti-United, anti-reform, anti-reconstructionist, anti-difference. That's the difference. We're not saying they're wrong and we're right. We're all right. We just do it differently.
Yeah. No, it'd be nice. I mean, that's the vision, right? Is to be pro everyone and anti no one. And I think that's something Masorti in particular struggles with, because we tend to define ourselves by punching out on both sides. Well, we're not Orthodox or we're not Reformed, so I guess we're whatever's left. That's not actually a very good way to identify ourselves either. We should be able to articulate what we are and not what we're not. And that's a challenge we have to face as a movement, that we tend to define ourselves by antis rather than pros. And it makes other people see us as fractious, and perhaps deservedly so. Right? If you can't define yourself in terms of what's good about it, and only it's about what you're not, then maybe it's not a great way to define yourself. That's true for many things. I'm sorry, Sarah.
Just thinking about your point of ritual slaughter, should the reform movement have considered what it would mean to the more traditional people?
That's the key question, right? And I don't know that I have an answer, because they're entitled to have their own view of the halakha and slaughter. And by the way, I don't think they're entirely wrong in terms of the actual position they took. Should it matter to them that other Jewish movements won't agree with them? I mean, if it mattered to us that if we became egalitarian, we'd be different from Orthodoxy, would we not be egalitarian? Right? I think it has to be, we have to create a situation where we can have multivocal, at the same time coexisting opinions about what kashrut is and what Shabbat is and how halakha works, without it being a competition over this is the right one and that's the wrong one. So I wouldn't tell them not to do it, consider the feelings of Orthodoxy, because that's not really their business. They can focus on their own business. But it is really hard when someone outside picks it up and goes, "Oh, look at what the Jews said." And I know that they themselves are really horrified, because they never intended it to be the Jewish position. It was just an internal memo for Reform Judaism, but somebody saw it and it got to the press. And that's the issue in some way, is the difference between how we talk internally versus how we talk externally. And that difference has largely been eliminated in the era of social media, because there is no internal and external anymore. There's few places where there's kind of Jewish meeting across many different cultures and communities, which is not observed and analyzed by others who don't really understand the context. So it's made it harder, I think, in a world where everyone's being watched and every opinion is being analyzed and available to everyone all the time. And that's why it matters. I mean, that's why the Hanukkah version of anti-Semitism matters, and why it's the one we're dealing with most. We're not really dealing with the Purim version of anti-Semitism at the moment. The anti-Semitism we're dealing with mostly is the Hanukkah kind. The Purim type anti-Semitism, I guess, is kind of, old-fashioned, Nazis and, Oswald Mosley, but Oswald Mosley is gone, right? The anti-Semitism we're dealing with in the UK is largely the Hanukkah kind, and it's much harder to deal with because it's much more nuanced and it's confusing and it's not clear who the bad guy is. And it's why it's so important to think about and to talk about. And I think the Yevsekstia sets a very good historical example in terms of looking at what happened then and hopefully learning from it. And I really thank you for being here with me this evening to learn a bit about it. I encourage you to continue doing so, and very much recommend, if you're at all interested in these questions around anti-Semitism, the book People Love Dead Jews. It was a really, really good read. And she puts her finger on a lot of these issues in a way that few people can with clarity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you. Have a good night.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.